Hello there, world spirits, to Sessions of Spirit number 36, How to be an Unforgettable Agent of History with Hegel. You might not know much about Hegel, but you might think that the world needs some changing, and you might be an activist, you might be very interested in being the change you want to see in the world. You've come to the right place, but a lot has taken place by this point in these sessions. So in order to help you get into it, because this is not your ordinary understanding, this guy Hegel did something really unusual and profound for philosophy that we're still grappling with here hundreds of years later. So I will go through the first 35 sessions within 2 to 3 minutes. And although that sounds like a feat, I have been able to stick within those bounds and still makes sense. But if you want to really dig into them, all the sessions are for free on YouTube or some other medium. And it's because genuine philosophy should be universal. And my goal is to have that kind of science, that kind of wisdom in our world. So let's do this recap starting now. Whoops. So the first Sessions of Spirit began with Hegel as the greatest philosopher, not because of his hubris or his ego, but because he put his ego aside and he literally spent till 37 years of age learning and mastering over 100 other philosophers before him, so he could stand on their shoulders, standing on the shoulders of giants, and didn't just summarize them, put them into one mega system, which is what we're teaching today. For session number 2, nobody understood this for 200 years because of one-sidedness. Session 3 is that his dialectic is way grander than people make it out to be. It's metaphysical and epistemological. When you understand it, it allows you to release your spirit and change the world. The 4th session is you get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel. By number 5, grasping the circle of reason, which number 6 sounds religious, but philosophy is the sublation of religion, not the negation. Number 7 is it's because of a universal logic that we're going to put into modern notation to win the Nobel Peace Prize to change the world. Number 8 is that this logic looks like it's polemics, but number 9 is really actually sublation, which is the polemic of polemics. The 10th is that Hegel wrote a masterclass in this called The Science of Logic, which 11 is really profound, is the ineffable articulating itself. Number 12 is that this is the purpose of life, is to live this logic. To 13, release all of our spirits because we're all valuable. Number 14 is that this connection feels like a connection to God, what religion calls God. Number 16, no, or 15, no, is that we can talk about this atheistically as an infinite science and connecting to our higher selves. And number 16 was that this is what our gurus have been talking about for thousands of years as this logic implicit, but not explicit. Number 17 is that we have to sublate the superstitious mysticism with the power of now and genuine mysticism or speculative thought. 18 is that the limit of our speculative thought is the limit of our fun, games, and flow. Number 19 is that genuine philosophy is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be full of laughter. Number 20 is that you use this laughter to sublate all the other religions you feel like you're in competition with. And then number 21 is that this allows you to be an ideal philosopher that gets beyond evil, which is really just ignorance and one-sidedness. And 22 is that we apply this to real technologies that are disrupting things in the world because they're not really that wise. The most disruptive technology is really just this science of logic and wisdom. Number 23 is that we have to make this logic more concrete by showing it in particular examples in the synchronicity doctrine of philosophies. Number 24 is that this makes our interpersonal dynamics as philosophers more sublative instead of reactionary and negative. Number 25 is that we showed how to do this and not just talk about it by sublating particular religions, all the main ones. Number 26 is we did the opposite with existentialists and sublated them too. Number 27 is that we sublated capitalism, communism, socialism to get over this existential crisis as a community. 28 is that we did this with the atheistic religion, which is Buddhism. 29 is that we do this also, we sublate also absolute logic, absolute atheism and its axioms and its contradictory, hypocritical, unjustified grounds. Number 30 is that when you really grasp this all concretely, you are the sublation of it all. You're wrapped up in it intimately. Our language is itself objectively the speculative logic working itself through us and us through it. The dialectic can end up in double binds, which is what horror is resulting in, this paralysis, which you need speculative logic to break out of. This is how we break out of double binds, not just in ourselves, but in our communities, and we don't repeat colonialism or imperialism as we're spreading this new wisdom. Number 34 is that we break out of the matrix for the first time by grasping the true, genuinely philosophical beginning with Descartes and where his limit was. And then 35 last time was that now that we're on the native soil of philosophy, we're going to steer the ship to introduce a new world spirit that we sort of talked about in session number 3 and 4, that when you truly understand Hegel and this true beginning, philosophical beginning, you can change the world and sort of start putting things in its right order. Okay, this leads us to today's session. 36 SOS. SOS stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls. Kind of like genuine philosophy is supposed to be making the world better. It's not just supposed to be theoretical. And yes, we're talking about this world spirit and how to be an unforgettable agent of history with this genuine philosophy of Hegel's. So you'll see I put a picture here of the great women of history. And this kind of pertains to our talk because it's a great missing element in the history of philosophy that I think shouldn't be forgotten. And I think when we achieve this genuine philosophy, Hegel says everybody is rational and capable of wisdom. And I think we're going to see something incredible happen, that we don't repeat the past, not in that way. But let's do the summary paragraph. Today's session goes like this. How do we repeat the magic that Hegel was cultivating into the dragon seed of his living and breathing philosophy back in the early 1800s? What did he grasp in his works that has been missing for the last 200 years, rendering the teachings of his philosophy impotent and lacking the infinite vigor and vitality that the Romantics were famous for? Where the genuine philosopher was just as much a poet as a scientist, family member, moral communitarian, and religious hero of virtue, as well as an upstanding, inspiring statesperson. Where philosophy pulses through the veins with a passion equally balanced by a passionless calm and a rising of such wisdom to its true and dignified place, not in the backrooms of forgotten departments of academia, but as the lifeblood and driving force coursing through the spirit of all humanity. We must learn his philosophy in its true depth to change ourselves into what we wish to see in the world, and then go out and will it into being. Hopefully that excites those who want to take some action. But let's get into the theory now and unpack how to do this really wisely, because there is a way to do this in the wrong way, or in a limited way. So the last session we talked about how Descartes was taking us out of this limited form of philosophy, kind of breaking us out of this matrix, and then leading us down this path of really embodying this philosophy in a real way, and getting out of what Hegel calls ordinary understanding, and getting out of these double binds and starting to think truly clearly at all levels, ontologically and epistemologically. So when you start doing this, Hegel says it's mysticism. So genuine philosophy, as we covered in previous sessions, is mysticism, but it's not the superstitious mysticism that atheism and modern science is rallying really hard against and trying to negate and cancel. Hegel is also canceling that to a certain degree. He's saying real science is based on not these irrational miracles, but that the rational miracles that we are kind of an embodiment of. The fact that pure thought is emerging in the sensuous world is kind of miraculous, because we don't normally think about the thought categories themselves having an existence of their own. But he says that's what's kind of mystical about it, but the way that it works itself out is in this rational system. So what happens to you when you start to be speculative and achieve this apotheosis, this concrete God, this theopoiosis, this spirit that Hegel keeps talking about, the Übermensch that we spoke about before, when you start breaking free the restrictions of your own mind, you start to achieve a mystique around yourself. Why? Because speculative philosophy is mystical, but it's scientifically mystical. So this word mystique starts to follow you as an agent of history, and it starts to make you unforgettable to the people who are around you and in your presence. Why is this though? Well, let's look at the definition of mystique in the ordinary way. So from the dictionary, it says, A mystique is a fascinating aura of mystery, awe, and power surrounding someone or something. This is appropriate, but we're going to give the logical determinations of it. So where does this mystery come from? Where does this awe and power come from? It comes from the way the understanding works in the world compared to this genuine higher levels of reason that transcends ordinary thinking, because you're able to think in contradictions and hold them in your mind in a concrete unity. That means it's defined. It has like things inside of it that you can think. It has details. Where there's a kind of unity where you see people who, if they can't explain something, what they do is they just give it a name and they say it exists. It's a thing. You know, like God. It's omnipotent. It's all powerful. And you say, well, what is it? Like, what does it do? Like, what does it look like? What, like, well, tell me some detail about it. No, it's always a beyond that's indeterminate. You can't know it because it's perfect somehow. But you can never know the perfection yourself. Or you can have a philosophical concept. And somebody says, well, what does that concept mean? And they can't unpack it because it's not concrete. There's no details in it. It's just, okay, they have a lump of something. But because they don't have the clarity to grasp it concretely, they can't explain it. They can't unfold the necessity of it. That's the point of a clear definition. So this definition we get is hitting on the right points, but it's not getting to the actual dialectical logic of a real definition. But the power of mystique is not lost on people, even in this definition. And Hegel emphasizes that this has been a real powerful phenomenon in human history. In fact, it's how change happens. So he gives an example of Aristotle and Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great is still remembered to this day, like, you know, thousands of years later, because he did something that gave him this mystique, this mystical, awe-inspiring power. And he got it from, of course, a philosopher, not just any philosopher, but Hegel regards as the greatest philosopher other than himself. And the reason why Hegel is so great is because he's standing on the shoulders of Aristotle. He took literally everything Aristotle did and completed what he couldn't finish. But the point of the story in Mystique, like Aristotle gave Alexander a mystique. A lot of people think that Aristotle was just an empiricist, a logician, all that kind of stuff. But here's Hegel saying, no, when you understand the true nature of what Aristotle was doing, he was a speculative philosopher. He was a mystical philosopher, but not the indeterminate kind of Plato. He was able to determine the realm of forms through the empiricism, through the logical observations of nature. It's just a process of purification. So already our understanding of Aristotle is starting to get a little more mystical, more of a mystique, because Hegel's breaking stereotypes. But let's read the rest of the quote here from Hegel's History of Philosophy. He says, Aristotle is known to be profound, thorough, an abstract metaphysician, and it is evident that he meant seriously with Alexander. That Aristotle did not follow with Alexander the ordinary superficial method of educating princes might be confidently expected from the earnestness of one who well knew what was truth and true culture. It is also evident from the circumstance that Alexander, while in the midst of his conquest in the heart of Asia, when he heard that Aristotle had made known his achromatic doctrines in speculative metaphysical writings, wrote him a reproachful letter in which he said that he should not have made known to the common people what they too had worked to get out together. So him and Aristotle. To this, Aristotle replied that though published, they were really just as much unpublished as before. So when you grasp this speculative thinking, you can be talking to people directly. And because there's such a gap between the two thinkings of ordinary education, like what Hegel's saying here is what Aristotle did not do with Alexander. He did not teach him the ordinary way of thinking. He did give him the mystique, the mystical stuff, and he gave it to him straight. And what had happened, it really empowered, it gave a lot of power to Alexander, who was young enough to actually carry it out in the world, whether for good or for bad. It just had this mystique where wherever he went, he was treated as this figure that was somehow supernatural. And some people laughed at him, of course, but it had this real effect on people who thought he was God on earth. And so when Aristotle started to reveal the mystery and started teaching people it, he got worried that his mystique was going to be threatened because the magic trick is going to be dissolved in terms of other people being able to see the speculative nature of their own reality. But of course, Aristotle says, well, don't worry about it, Alexander, because ordinary thinking has a hard time grasping the thought, even if you show it to them directly. And it's just a testament to how powerful this thinking really is. And that's why a lot of people can abuse it and try and change not the world, but change the world to fit their circumstances and create problems. But a lot of people think, well, no, it's not truly. This is not what Hegel is saying. Hegel's a scientist and he's an atheist, and all this mystical stuff is just what he's trying to shed because he's in the 1800s and he's, the priesthood is trying to, make sure that he doesn't say anything foolish because they paid for his early education. So they're saying he's just appeasing the church. But here's Hegel directly saying in his science of logic, not in his philosophy of religion, not in his philosophy of spirit. We've said this quote before earlier in the session, but now we're going to put into a different context. He's saying speculative truth, which we now know is the kernel of real, genuine philosophical thinking, a real, genuine ideal philosopher is a speculative one. And he's saying speculative truth, it may also be noted, means very much the same as what in special connection with religious experience and doctrines used to be called mysticism. The term mysticism is at present used as a rule to designate what is mysterious and incomprehensible. So this is what the mystique definition from the dictionary is kind of hitting on. It does have this mystery to it. And in proportion as their general culture and way of thinking vary, the epithet is applied by one class to denote the real and the true, which is how Hegel means it, but by another name, everything connected with superstition and deception, on which we first of all remark that there is mystery in the mystical, only, however, for the understanding which is ruled by the principle of abstract identity. Remember that first type of identity where it's a blob and you can't say anything about it because it's not concrete? So another way of saying that is what Hegel calls abstract identity. So God, that's why Hegel says philosophy sublates religion, is because we actually get to define and think God and critique God in this beyond, right? You can know it for yourself. And so it becomes a concrete unity instead of this abstract identity, which kind of has a mysticism to it. So he's saying that, yes, there's a mysticism and a mystery, but it's not this abstract identity. He says, whereas the mystical, as synonymous with the speculative, is the concrete unity of those propositions which understanding only accepts in their separation and opposition. And if those who recognize mysticism as the highest truth are content to leave it in its original utter mystery, their conduct only proves that for them too, as well as for their antagonists, thinking means abstract identification, and that in their opinion, which is not scientific, therefore truth can only be won by renouncing thought, or as it is frequently expressed, by leading the reason captive. Or leaving, should be leaving probably. But this is where you sort of get people saying and abusing Hegel's logic, that you're not supposed to know something, but here's Hegel saying that that's not the true kind of mystery, and he's showing the logic of it. You do determine it, and it seems like it would destroy the mystery because you're basically telling the magic trick, because everything that is actual is rational, everything that is rational is actual. But he's saying when you do this properly, you can still keep transcending the understanding because reason is constantly moving beyond. So he's saying, even though it's rational, it still can become a scientific mysticism that still preserves the mystery. But there's a fake kind of way to do it where you try and preserve the mystery artificially. And you do this in this kind of religious form rather than the scientific philosophy form. So that's how, as we covered previously, this mystique can still be rationally thought. And it can still make you powerful and give you this clarity of thinking that is scientific. So a secondary definition is of mystique. It's an air of secrecy surrounding a particular activity or subject that makes it impressive or baffling to those without specialized knowledge. So we just saw him explain that in the previous paragraph, but the contrast between the right kind of mysticism mystique, and the sort of abusive kind, the kind that doesn't allow you to be a human, because the instinct of a human that separates us from animals is literally just the ability to think reasonably and know things rationally. So we can see that the definitions hold some logical truth, but Hegel's starting to put it into the systematic totality and connecting it with real philosophy, the real mystique of philosophers. There's still a mystique around a genuine philosopher. Wherever a genuine philosopher goes, it's still pretty incredible. It's kind of like the Buddhist monks, wherever they went, they were doing these koans, which would make people question their reality and get to the deeper essence of it, that behind the mundane is actually an incredible profoundness that we talked about in the previous sessions of spirit, where we said, the absolutely profound is imminent. It's all here now. All that has to happen is you have to realize it. But it seems like there's a secrecy and it can be abused. This kind of speculative knowledge has been in the works for thousands of years, and it has been abused. But here's the three kind of characteristics of how to describe somebody with real mystique as a philosopher. So a genuine philosopher has a mystique just because they grasp speculative thought logically in that universal logic. And it's a person who grasps the right order of that universal logic, which Hegel gives us determinately in the science of logic. So he makes that blob, he actually fills that in. So Plato's realm of forms is like the abstract identity. It's a blob, that's perfect thought, but you can't say anything about it because you're imperfect. But Hegel says, no, he makes that the concrete mystical unity, and he fills it in with the determinations of pure thought in their right order. The order is the hard thing. You could just put random categories in there and say being, nothing, just like throw them in there. But that's not the impressive thing. The impressive thing is that he shows the scientific systematic development of those thoughts. And it leads to this incredible sense of impressive clarity that can baffle people who are stuck in the ordinary consciousness. Like Aristotle said, you can say this to people and they still won't get it. This empowers you once you internalize that order in yourself. Your language, like we talked about with Wittgenstein, your language game gets upgraded because the order of your pure thoughts orders the language of your grammar, or it orders the grammar of your language, and vice versa, I guess. So it's a really incredible back and forth that happens in your being and your thinking. This is why you can change the world. So you're a person who has a mystique, has a very powerful way of talking, of communicating. Speech, Hegel says, is actually way more profound than we think it is. It's amazing if you really are. There's millions of combinations of like guttural sounds and larynx sounds we can make, but we narrowed it down to, between 26 and 500 sounds, and we can communicate these things you can't touch, see, or taste, but you can kind of hear them, but the pure thoughts that are nested in them can't be heard. They're just being represented by the vibrations from your voice. But communicating in universals is what reaches the spirit in people. The deep inner core of a human being is called the notion, and the notion gets pulled out of you. And if you think about history, this is what all the greatest leaders or people that have been preserved in history is doing good. They speak in this way. And usually they have speechwriters that they pay to speak in this way. So for instance, JFK, John F. Kennedy, he has this famous nothing to fear but fear itself. That's like a negation of negation. He's just doing sublation there. So behind the sensuousness, behind the fear, we're seeing the pure logical categories moving in that proper order. And when you do it right, it comes out as these kind of famous sayings that resonate in some way. Like, yeah, the only thing to be afraid of is fear itself. Same with Martin Luther King's A Dream speech. If you listen to his dream, he's mixing the super sensuous with the sensuous, and he's trying to sublate them. And he's amazing at it because as a preacher, you learn from the Bible all these speculative universals, but you learn them in contingent sort of sensuous form, which is why the logic is hard to grasp, and sometimes people can kind of get off the rails and focus on the particulars. But interestingly, Martin Luther King's favorite philosopher was Hegel. So that might have supercharged his speech. And in a couple of speeches, if you look online, I should have included it here, he actually takes directly from Hegel's writings the dialectical nature of reality and uses it in his speeches directly. So we know for sure that Martin Luther King was using Hegelian dialectic to empower his universals in his speech. Then you got Mahatma Gandhi. So everybody knows that Gandhi's famous saying, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Well, he's just sublating the individual and the universal, right? It's the same logic. And when you hit it in the right order, it has this resonancy to it. Same with Shakespeare. To be or not to be, that is the question. Well, he's just repeating the beginning of the science of logic. You know, you have pure being, it turns into pure nothing. And you go back and forth. And then if you realize the higher nature of it, that's what becoming is. Heraclitus is becoming. Of course, Shakespeare uses in a romantic way, existentially. It's like profound how he uses it, right? It's communicating in like almost pure speculative form. Socrates was doing it all the time in his dialogues. He was flipping them, the categories. So he understood the dialectic implicit in himself. That's what the Socratic method is. It's speculative thought, but he didn't put it into a system. So it wasn't true science. It was just the beginning of the philosophic method, genuine philosophic method. Plato comes after and starts putting it in a system, but he makes the universals around beyond. And then Aristotle comes and says, well, actually, you can start filling out, you can start determining that realm. And his rhetoric was based on that. So if you look here, I actually reference Aristotle's enthymemes. And when you speak in universals, it doesn't look like you're speaking in notions or individual particular universal and then a syllogism, but you actually are, but you're doing it in a broken way usually. And he says the best orators, the best, especially back in ancient Greece, rhetoric was like everything. You go in the town square and you talk and you impress people, and that's why Socrates was really good at it. But he says when you're talking in syllogisms, you're usually talking in enthymemes. And enthymemes can be incomplete syllogisms, like you missed the major premise and you only say like the minor and the conclusion. But when you're a really good speculative philosopher, you recognize that universal logic and you can complete the arguments. You can see what's missing in the logic and you can complete things that are missing to other people who are operating not in that universal mode, but only implicitly universal in their particular mode. But of course, all of art is kind of like this rhetoric, this beautiful kind of mastery of the particular and the universal. When you're not fixed by the particularities and you have this freedom, you can grasp the essence behind the imagery and the symbols. That's where some of the best poetry comes from, the most speculative, the most resonant. And this is kind of what Plato was doing in his Timaeus, even though he didn't grasp the full system. That's why we love it. He was talking in a speculative way. And if you want to read about it, just go to Lectures on the History of Philosophy, where Hegel's talking about Plato and Aristotle. Okay, so speech is very powerful, but it can be used in the wrong way as well. So Hitler is also in this list. Hitler was known to be an incredibly powerful orator. So he was doing something with the universals, but he wasn't doing it in the total scientific system. If you grasp it in that right order, it leads you to the good automatically because it starts separating you from the caprice. But besides the material war of World War II and World War I, there was a spiritual war going on with the Jewish people, with the Aryan race and the Vedic philosophy. It wasn't just a material conflict. Underneath it is always ideology. So that's what we've seen with Hitler. He didn't grasp the universals concretely or concretely enough to realize and recognize himself in the other. So that's where we see the universals being wielded, not with genuine wisdom. But of course, Hitler had his truth. He thought he was being rational. And so in some way, we have to self-recognize with where he went wrong, what double binds was he in, that we can sublate and figure out, okay, you know, how did this skewed reasoning lead down this path and get to the truth of it so we can stop it determinately in a new culture of wisdom, in this new higher spirit. Another thing that I want to mention here is that sometimes speaking in universals isn't enough. So it has to do with you have to vibrate with the time and the epoch that you're in. So unfortunately, a lot of women philosophers in the past were erased. So one of them was Aspasia of Miletus, whatever the name is. This is the woman that Socrates himself references as an inspiration, that she spoke to him and started teaching him this speculative way of thinking, I guess, or really influenced him in his philosophy. but there's not much known about her because history treated women not as a universal. They sort of erased them. So we want to make sure that the new spirit actually has the voice of women, the voice of anybody, children, anybody that has the universal are allowed to speak in genuine philosophy. And this is the new education system that transcends ageism, sexism, racism, all these types of things, all these one-sided dialectics. And we get to the true reasoning that releases us from physiognomy. Physiognomy does have a hold on you, strangely, if you're not rational, but that's what we're going to try and correct. So language is incredibly powerful. Of course, we talked about before that when you're a real agent of history, you don't go and move in the spirit of negation only. When you move in the spirit of negation, you start to get trapped in this sophism and these double binds where the community starts to realize that you're manipulating language to get what you want. But when you're a genuine philosopher, you actually try and refute people by making them laugh and having them self-determine for themselves what their limit is so that they grow and that they can become better and more ideal. And you do this through dialectic, another contradiction, which is benign violation theory. That's what real humor is, I think, philosophically. It's how you get out of double binds and build a relationship in a pleasant way. But you have to be careful. And this is sort of why me, as a trying to be or becoming this potential agent of history with Hegel's work, I'm being very careful that I'm not a master of these violations yet, and I acknowledge that. So if you make benign violations, people are going to negate you, and they're going to take those negations and take them out of context, remove them from the benignness, and just make it look like you're a jerk. And if you get somebody doing that from opposite sides of dialectics, then you get this kind of mutual canceling, this double bind and canceling. So what I'm doing is I'm just staying benign, and I'm just trying to sublate all the dialectics because I'm going to get negated no matter what. And I'm just playing it safe, you could say, to make the double binds happen less quickly. Because time becomes a problem, as we discussed later. Having clarity and efficaciousness allows you to get to the truth before the animal brain kicks in and you can't reason anymore with your prefrontal cortex. So this is what all world agents of world history have to really realize as genuine philosophers, that the rhetoric, the way you speak with other human beings really is this spirit, this logical process that you can be skillful in. But if you're very skillful in it, and Hegel supercharges that, then you can actually change the world, change people in a way that they want to be changed or that they can change themselves. Sublation, though, is really the only thing that protects us in the end. That's why every lesson is about it. It's not about just having the faith that the world is rational. I mean, it is about that, but you have to develop that faith. So don't react in negation. Try and, which is your default, right? Which is our default. Try and act in the sublation and try and determine that faith that the world is rational from those abstract identities into these concrete ones. And don't be afraid to get into the details. We don't want to end up in this indeterminacy because it starts to sound religious. And that's the limit of religion. The truth of religion is more concrete. And that's why it's a sublation, not a negation. We are determinate, thinkable, self-determining spirit. So this is what the 16 Paths of Parmenides was covering, the right way to have these conversations. But when you supercharge it with the logic, it gives you the right order to talk about all these topics and gives you the universals in the right order. And in some ways, it's just repeating what Aristotle's topics were doing by teaching how to have the conversations, but also some of the topics that he later prepared, I guess, Alexander for. He said, this is what you're going to come across in the square. And here's how you sort of sublate all these dialectics. Of course, I don't think he used the word sublate. He had some other word in Greek, but that's basically what you need to master if you're going to be really, really good at this. He says from his topics, I call the same thing element and topic. For an element or a topic is a heading under which many enthymeme fall. So this is why the science of logic is powerful, is because it's an order, right? We're going from pure being, pure nothing. We're actually building upwards with the same element. An element is just a repeating thing in a system. But a higher dialectic, a higher topic, actually has nested elements in it. And if you don't understand those elements, then you don't understand the principles of that stage. So you can't have very clear discourses, rational discourses, because all the syllogisms underneath it aren't clear to you, because the elements aren't clear. So that's why he's saying that topics and elements, you're just, whenever you're talking about a topic, you're really just talking about a dialectic, an opposite pair that is treated as a concrete unity. So that's why Hegel says in his logic that he's giving you hundreds of conversations that happen every day in the public square, in your conversations with your loved ones. We're just doing that logic over and over again. If you don't know how to sublate the topic, then you get trapped in these broken enthymemes that start to restrict you. A lot of people have abused this though in language. This can lead to people trying to trick and become sophists, like we talked about with the double binds. This can lead to cults. And if you understand that people have limitations to ordinary thinking, they can't grasp speculative thought, they will make it purposely obscure and try and undermine all your categories speculatively by turning them into their opposites to unground you, like we talked about before. And so they make it indeterminate, and that you're not allowed to question the indeterminate. And then if you're not allowed to question the indeterminate, then you're under the authority of it, like the Lord, right? So what we're trying to do here as introducing a new genuine philosophy is saying, no, that first moment of negation is allowed to happen at all times. You are allowed to critique because that's how you start determining things. But there's 11 criterion of how to recognize a real cult leader from somebody who is a real philosopher that is just speculative and kind of mystical. The genuine philosopher wants you to understand the reasoning. So the only difference between a cult leader and a speculative philosopher is that the philosopher gives you the order. They want you to determine it for yourself, and they empower you through laughter and through bringing the best out of you while canceling your limit. And so if somebody's not doing that, then they're intentionally using the dialectic to manipulate you. And so that's why for me, I'm giving these sessions of spirit for free. I'm giving it all out here for free to say to people, no, we want you to understand this. This is how the nature of reality works. And the more people that understand it, the more that they can protect themselves as well and start creating this higher spirit. It creates this clear kind of leadership, point number 5. But the only person who's really clear on it is Hegel, but it's in everything that has truth. So in contemporary leadership management and psychology, I found this website talking about this polarity thinking where real leadership is based off of it. And if you open it up, it's really just talking about sublation. Polarity just means a dialectic on both sides, but Hegel says a polarity isn't the true dialectic. It's more concrete. Polarity happens not in the beginning. Polarity actually, dialectic has to develop itself into polarity. Polarity is a reflective category. It's more concrete than the beginning dialectics. So these people are grasping dialectical thought, but they're doing it in a sensuous way that's not getting to the pure essence. But you can see even contemporary reality starting to realize for itself organically the truth that Hegel gave us 200 years ago. So this is what it looks like. This is how you recognize people doing it in as current agents of world spirit. Even in the abstract form, we're approximating sublation implicitly. This is the logic. This is sublation implicit. They will talk about all this stuff, but they won't hit on the essential movements of, abstract understanding, negation, sublation. It's not that clear, but they are getting kind of the essence of it. So we're just aiming for a hyper clear version of this. That's why we can go in and teach leadership classes. Oh, here's what you're saying logically in the universal logic, and here's how it applies to not just this particular zone, it actually applies to all these zones. And here's a couple of zones where it doesn't apply in this way. It's just profound. So to help people gain access to this knowledge, we really want people to know we basically have to restructure the education system and make it available to everybody. So that includes media. So as genuine philosophers, we have to create genuinely philosophical media, which doesn't really exist. Anything that becomes more speculative is usually in this negative moment of Hegel, where he has the slaughter bench. He's going to cancel things. He's, pain, sophism. But most people don't get to the other side where this is developing and progressing as world spirit, concretizing itself into more and more blessed notions, more and more peaceful science as a process of self-discovery, where you don't have to war and fight to the death. You literally just, hey, I don't understand that phenomena or that person or that thing. and you just do an experiment, and you peacefully just uncover what was missing, what the dialectic is that's undergirding that phenomena. So I think for me anyway, I'm starting up these Twitch streams, this open broadcast software, where I'm going to start broadcasting these sessions sort of around the world and answering people's questions as best as I can in any medium that they need, whether it's in these mega Bible studies. We're going to start keeping track of the progress so that we track world spirit progressing and people can see the progress, because it doesn't look like, when you look back at history, that anything progressive is happening. It just looks like war and human beings, being fickle and, being our worst natures. It's hard to recognize that there's progress if you don't grasp the super sensuous universality of the logic underneath that's developing as the idea in sensuous form. So we will be tracking, like, okay, how far are we on the Bible study in terms of reorganizing the Bible in the order of those categories. Same with the Quran. We're going to be tracking how many passages we have, how many categories are now oriented and lined up in the Bible studies or the Quran studies. The same thing is going to be tracked in the synchronicity document as a whole, where we have all the philosophies being filled out. And so we'll track, well, how many philosophers do we have in the document? Well, we have 6,000. Okay, now we have 6,500. It just keeps kind of growing until everybody is basically a philosopher in that document. And that's the new universal citizenship in this new world spirit. You will be in the synchronicity document because technically everybody is a philosopher in this higher spirit of speculative thinking. But at first, we're just going to do it for the famous people because they were the ones that articulated the universals the best, at least in a finite way. Then, of course, we're going to talk about, like a spectator sport, how people are debating in sublation. And it'll be kind of like research and development is just doing that with the unknown at the cutting edge. So research and development will also be tracked, what kind of discoveries are being made across all journals. So people can see what dialectics are coming into explicit form. And of course, we'll be tracking how many wisdom quizzes are being filled out, how many are actually mastered. And then once you master it, how many more dialectics have you sublated in your personal psychology, and in what order? So it's a really profound way of tracking the new education system that matches people's real potentials and doesn't just do this weird, treat everybody the same, even though we are pure thought. It gets down to the syllogism, and the order is kind of what keeps us the same. But you can express that in different categories that matches your sensuous particularity. So if you're good at art, you do the art. If you do anything that matches your talent set, then you're recognized for that in that logic. So we're going to be tracking all this stuff and showing the world that we are progressing. So a new agent of history, when you become one and you understand the speculative logic, it's like a shift happens. You're still using all the same categories, but the order really makes you see, you cut through the thick of things. You get to the heart of things quicker. It's like what the heliocentric model did for astronomy. When we moved up to geocentric model, there's a lot of contradictions in the geocentric model where, like, we had to create complex models about, well, if the Earth was the center, how do you explain the sun and the moon? And then the heliocentric model came along, and it just was a lot more coherent. So this coherence is really important. I'm going really slowly in this talk, but you have to grasp this right order to get to this coherence, because you're basically taking off your reality viewer goggles. So we have this filter that's distorting things because the order is not quite right, and we're correcting that order. And to give you an analogy of what it's like a tugboat versus a jet boat. And this kind of spiritual GPS, the right order that's implicitly in you, kind of like your conscience in a way. It allows you to sort of be like this map. If X is where you're trying to go, like this is where real wisdom is for humanity, the new paradigms that are going to change the world. It's like having people who are in ordinary thinking, having really high IQs or lots of information processing. They sort of like can go really quickly, but they don't really have a GPS. So they don't know how to get to the X efficiently. They know the X is there, but they can go very, very quickly, boom, boom, and they can bounce all over the place very fast. Whereas a tugboat is not as fast, but let's say the tugboat has a GPS and it knows exactly where the X is, it just goes straight there. So in the end, the speedboat might see the tugboat and then in the last moment race it to the X and might beat it there, but most of the time not. So this is what Hegel is doing for philosophy. It's moving out of abstract philosophy, which is this philosophy. That's why the smartest people in the world aren't doing Hegel, because it doesn't just have to do with linear thinking. He's showing us this straight line to get to the GPS spot. This is what the science of logic is. This is what the Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences is. It's a great equalizer in the world of philosophy because anybody can kind of do this once you get the order. And because Hegel's using the most simple categories, everybody's familiar with them. As long as you don't have actual physical disabilities or something like that that prevents you from thinking rationally, basically 80–90% of the population can do this. And that's what philosophy is supposed to be, to break out of this kind of sophism and this twisting around. I think it's really profound. Okay, one last example. So if you really want to be an unforgettable agent of history, you have to do something that's unforgettable concretely. And Hegel says it always has to do with the same thing. When you do something amazing, whether it's art, whether it's in religion, whether it's in philosophy, it always has to do with the concrete whole in some way. Even if it's just a fragment of it, you're putting it in a speculative form. And that's what we're going to do. So basically, we're shifting these tectonic plates using the science of logic to achieve this higher coherence where things just make sense. And we know it because it's this systematic understanding that we can know determinately. It's not that blob beyond. You don't just have to rely on this intuition, this spiritual GPS. You can determine it and move your tugboat along the waters of wisdom. So what are we going to do? That's this world-changing, unforgettable thing. Well, we're actually going to prove the existence of God for real, because Hegel sort of already did it. So we're going to do the atheistic tugboat version of the ontological proof of God, whereas Anselm did it in a way that Hegel disagrees with, and was why Kant and everybody else could easily refute it, is because he didn't grasp the orders and he attributed attributes to the wrong categories, which made contradictions possible in the wrong way. We're still dealing with contradictions, but we're doing it in the speculative right order. But when you don't have that speculative right order, you still have contradictions that are actually contradictory. They're not resolved. So I'm going to give, because we're running out of time a little bit, we're going to achieve a higher level of coherence on this ontological proof. And we're going to do it by reading this paragraph from Hegel. And I've already kind of quoted other sections of this in other sessions of Spirit, but in this one, I want to hit on this idea of coherence by the synthetic a priori. So if you're not an academic philosopher, this term synthetic a priori comes from Kant, who is the bigwig philosopher sort of before Hegel. And he came up with this incredible idea of synthetic a priori. So a priori means in the realm of pure thought, no sensuousness or nothing. And synthetic means that concepts can kind of move and connect to each other without any sensuousness. And they can kind of connect outside of themselves to other pure thoughts. And it's like a pure thought, an a priori pure thought, and an a priori pure thought connecting by a priori pure thought. So it's all pure thought moving in itself. And that's very unintuitive. That's very crazy to think about, because we're sensuous creatures and we only see our thoughts in material objects. They reflect our thoughts. We have thoughts about things. Our thoughts aren't things in themselves that are growing in themselves, right? You apply your thoughts to objects and from objects. We're just subjective, right? This isn't really happening in the world. We're just pattern recognizing things. But Hegel's saying, no, the scientific way of talking about this coherence and the proper ontological proof of God has to do with everything about this synthetic a priori. He said this is the greatest thing that Kant did, besides introducing dialectic in its broken form. But he said this thing is the emergent thing that is unforgettable when you really understand what it means. Let's use it. Okay. From his lesser logic, he's saying, or his greater logic. Now, though it might seem that the transition from the notion into objectivity is not the same thing as the transition from the notion of God to his existence, it should be borne in mind, on the one hand, that the determinate content, God, makes no difference in the logical process, and the ontological proof is merely an application of this logical process to the said content. What he's talking about here is that Anselm was trying to say that the notion of God, like the idea of God in our heads, or in its own head maybe, if it's really amazingly good and it's the best that there can be, then it's like that popsicle. It's like, well, I love an idea of a popsicle, but it's even better if the popsicle is real. So the truly best thing in the world has to have existence, has to actually be that, has real being. It's not just a thought of it or an idea. It actually has material existence. And so it says this is the proof of the being of God. That's ontology. That's why it's called the ontological proof. Is you're going from just pure thought, which is not ontological, it's just thinking, to an actual being in the world really exists. And so Hegel's saying that in his science of logic, he's describing the same process in the proper order. And I'm going to give you his notion and his version of existence kind of quickly here, and then show what Anselm was missing, which was why it was easily attackable, because it was mixing the categories up, because he was stuck in ordinary sensuous thought, trying to grasp the right order underneath. And once the world grasps this, it's going to lead to, I think, an incredible, unforgettable new way of thinking about these two worlds between the notion and being. To get further into the quote, he says, to this extent, we must admit, on the one hand, that the realization of the notion in the judgment is still not complete. So if you remember that diagram from the Buddhist sessions, we had the abstract notion, and then we had the judgment, right? The notion others itself into its own judgment, and then it turns into the syllogism, right? Where he's saying that even when the notion starts developing itself, it others itself into its own judgment. And a judgment is kind of like this separation. It's like this negation. So Hegel's saying, even in this externality, it looks a little bit like existence, because you have the notion and then something exists outside of it. Existence kind of has this externality to it. It's not just implicit or potential, but it actually exists in the real world outside of us objectively. And so Hegel is saying that to this extent, we must admit on the one hand that the realization of the notion in the judgment is still not complete. On the other hand, however, the mere determination of an object by predicates, when that determination is not at the same time the realization and objectification of the notion, also remains something so subjective that it is not even the genuine cognition and determination of the notion of the object. So he's saying something's going on here in pure thought. And he's saying it's between this notion and an object. Subjective in the sense of abstract reflection and uncomprehending pictorial thinking. So if you think about this pictorially, you're not grasping the true relationship between the notion and the object, Hegel is saying. And he's saying this is the mistake that Anselm made, because you're stuck in pictorial thinking. He said God, as the living God, and still more as absolute spirit, is known only in his activity. Man was merely instructed to recognize God in his works. Only from these can proceed the determinations. And that means we're not being indeterminate. You can know something, which are called properties, the properties of God, and in which too his being is contained. Thus, the philosophical cognition of his activity, that is, of himself, grasps the notion of God in his being and in his being in his notion. Being merely as such, or even determinate being, is such a meager and restricted determination that the difficulty of finding it in the notion may well be the result of not having considered what being or determinate being in itself is. So it seems like Hegel's knocking down this concept of determinate being or determination, and then is kind of praising them at the end here. So it looks like he's being a hypocrite, but he's actually talking about two different contexts. You can have determinate being in sensuous reality, but if you don't grasp the pure thought logic of determinate being, you don't grasp its the truth of it in reality, in like sensuous reality. So that's what he's saying. You have to grasp being and determinate being in the science of logic as pure thought in its notions to grasp the real ontological proof that's not making this mistake about God as being physically in the sensuous world that you can like walk up to and talk to like a human being. He's saying, no, you can only look at it through the movements in the world, which is what Jesus was talking about in terms of, I am the truth, the way, and the life. You can't get to the supersensuous realm unless you watch me, my movements, the logic of what I'm doing, because it's supersensuous. You have to watch it through me, through my acts, through my works, through my talking to you, the speculative nature of it. So this is how you start getting to the true proof, the true ontological proof. And it looks kind of like, it looks like this diagram. So what I just read probably won't make any sense because we're all sort of stuck in ordinary thinking in some way. I give you the explanation here in the comments, but I'll explain this picture quickly and then we'll wrap up here. So at the top is Anselm's version of this paragraph that Hegel's critiquing. So Anselm talks about this notion, this pure thought of God, but it's not actual God that has a being that's really actual in the world, right? This is technically the supersensuous world to him. He's calling this whole world the notion, and it's indeterminate, but it's perfect, it's necessary, it's heaven. So he's giving it names, but he's not giving us any details about what's in this thing. It's the blob that we're talking about. So he leaves the supersensuous realm a blob, and he just calls this is the notion of God. And then this notion kind of also has what he calls existence. And so what he calls existence is really just nature. And nature, existence is all of nature, and that it is determinate existence, so determinate that you can know this God object in it, God as an actual object in the real world. It's not just this notion. God doesn't just exist here. God exists here too, as an actual object in its existence. And Hegel says this is kind of true, but it's wrong because you're not thinking these worlds correctly. This is the proper way to think about what he's trying to do in his mind. This is the logical, scientific, ontological proof that I think is unforgettable to anybody who's studied Anselm and Hegel for a long time. Scholastically, this paragraph has been overlooked for potentially 200 years. But if we were going to prove the concept of God, this is probably the closest thing we have. And as world spirit comes through us, this will be what's resonating with people who are really serious about the truth. So how Hegel says and repeats these same movements is he says, this world that Anselm is calling the notion is actually the supersensuous realm. It's the realm of pure thought. So instead of the notion, we're saying pure thought is the real way to label this world. And you don't leave it indeterminate. It's not a blob. He says, you actually started with that, what we did with absolute atheism, what we did with existentialism, what we did by canceling sin is we return to the formal beginning. And it's not really the start of existence per se, because existence is so little, existence doesn't exist yet. There's not enough externality to have existence, but it is being. It's the beginning of being, of pure thought. And it turns itself into pure being, pure nothing, pure becoming. These are the categories that we read in Hegel's table of contents in the science of logic. You can see the logic is progressing in these categories. And the entire science of logic fits in here before it gets to, well, the doctrine of being fits in here before we get to the doctrine of essence and then the doctrine of the notion. But where Hegel puts existence in the notion is not like this, like Anselm did it. There's a logical concept of existence that proves itself before the notion of God even exists. So existence itself has to prove itself logically, and it happens in the doctrine of essence after the doctrine of being completes itself, after reality sort of completes itself. So these categories of existence and reality that we normally conflate together, Hegel is actually defining in an incredible way that we get to these nuances that gets beyond the sloppiness of the proofs that we're using and the assumptions that are in them. So once existence starts to develop, then the notion comes into form, but it's that beginning form of the notion. So the notion isn't the whole realm. What he was calling notion was just pure thought. Now we know that the notion is determinate thought. It is pure thought, but it's a determinate thought that has the universal, the individual, and the particular in it. It develops itself into its own judgment, which is not complete, like we read in the paragraph. It turns itself into a syllogism, but the syllogism is the universal form of the notion completed. And when you take that form immediately, it externalizes itself. It others itself in the supersensuous realm. It doesn't do this leap way over here. It doesn't make the leap from the supersensuous to the sensuous, which is what Anselm was doing. That leap that Anselm was trying to do is actually still in this realm. It's happening between the syllogism and this God object. The notion turns itself into its own externalized object through the syllogism. Pure reason. This coherence is how you prove the existence of God from its notion. So Anselm was saying we're proving God from the notion to its existence. Hegel's doing the same thing, but he's doing it in the right order. The only way that you can prove the notion of God to the object or the existence of God is through pure logic. The coherence model of truth applies to this realm. That's why I said it's the supersensuous coherence realm. The only way that you can do this is through system. You can't see this in the world. You can't go and touch the God object or the syllogism anywhere in the sensuous realm. That's all over here. So he's saying that if you know how to think supersensuously in the speculative form, you make this realm determinate, which is why he was able to solve and get to the real ontological proof, because all this stuff happening here is being, but it's supersensuous being. It starts with pure being that turns itself in all these other forms of being. The notion is just a form of being. It contains the being that Amsam was trying to find inside of itself already, because it's a form of it. The syllogism too is a form of being, and the object is the immediate form of the notion external to itself. So when the notion finishes itself, it kind of finishes subjective spirit or subjective logic, and it turns itself into the beginning of objective logic. So it's in an opposition which is external to itself. That externality feels like what's happening up here with Anselm between these two other realms. But he's saying Anselm's doing it too late. It has to happen here first before the supersensuous even turns itself into nature. So he's mistaking, he's conflating these categories and their order. And all it is conflating, it's the same categories, it's just in the wrong order, conflating them. That's why the right order and the speculative nature of the science of logic is incredibly profound, because it's determinate enough that we can logically think through this and find that coherence and think it for ourselves. So I think once people understand what I'm saying here and we start rereading Hegel in this determinate way, these proofs are going to be unforgettable. Like, this is absolutely incredible. And I'm not maybe doing a great job. Even if I was doing a great job, Aristotle says it's published, doesn't matter. People aren't going to get it, right? It's hiding in plain sight. And I know that's what's happening right now. But if you apply yourself to what Hegel is writing, this stuff is what all these other great minds were trying to do, but in actual rational clarity. Then we get this realm completing itself as the idea, and the idea others itself completely into contingent reality. So Anselm in them says, well, God is a necessary being. There's no contingent version of this. But Hegel says, yes, there is. He says the contingent version of this supersensuous realm is what spirit is. He says the only way you can know spirit in this realm is by grasping it in yourself as a thinker. And the thinker is a reunification. It's this realm coming through you as this final leg here in sensuous reality. The reason why I put these categories in green is because these are supersensuous. The laws of the universe is this realm coming through the sensuous realm. These are the sensuous terms for these logical determinations. So space is like this pure being. Time is the negation of it as pure nothing. Becoming is pure motion. You can see a one-to-one fractal reoccurrence. It's the same order happening or corresponding in this reality. So this is where the correspondence model of truth happens. What are we corresponding? We're corresponding the coherence of this world onto our experience of this world as the pure thought coming through the sensuous as spirit. As you grasp this order more and more concretely, you raise from abstract spirit to absolute spirit of God recognizing itself, recognizing its own coherence as a correspondence of itself in reality. So that's how I think we make sense of what all these people were trying to do in the past in their religious consciousness. And because we have 85% of the human species in religious consciousness still, because philosophy is not in its true form, it's degraded. It has no power. It has no mystique around it. It's just a bunch of egomaniacs that nobody wants to listen to because they're stuck in a realm of theory that has no practice. And the ones that are trying to do it practically are negated and treated as not real philosophers. So they're shunned from the sort of ivory tower where there is a little bit of power. So what we're going to do is use this kind of proof. It looks atheistic, but it's also what religion is trying to do. We just did that with Anselm. We're not negating Anselm. We're sublating Anselm. This is what it looks like. And once this clicks, once you study Hegel for yourself, the true profoundness of this, of what I'm experiencing myself, will come through in this new clarity. And it's going to call forth the spirit and the 85% of the people who feel this coherence in their faith, in their intuition, but they don't know how to articulate it. That's why they have to use the Bible. They have to use these sensuous texts that atheists and other people can make fun of because they can point out the contradictions. And religious consciousness doesn't know how to explain it determinately to show that it's speculative thought. It's still science. And that's why that divide persists. But once we show this, I think world spirit's going to start taking off, because this is literally the proof of God, or the beginning of the real proof of God. And that's going to make people very excited, because now you can know it as spirit. So showing this in the religious way is going to get 85% of the people on your side. But because we're doing it in the atheistic way, we can also get that last 15%. So this is how we get 100% of human beings mobilized on the theism, atheism dialectic, the secular, and the religious, the philosophical, the scientific. This is how we do it. And that's how we become the true world spirit and achieve critical mass to welcome God on earth, what genuine philosophy, according to Hegel, is supposed to be about. Okay, I hope you're a little bit more inspired. If you're a scholar and you really caught all of what I just said in its clarity, I hope you're pretty excited. If you're an atheist, we're going to be talking more about the atheist version tomorrow, so your truth is coming. But the peaceful revolution is all about this. If you have questions, that's part of the learning process. Negation is a part of this. Please feel free to do that on the Hegelians Who Want to Change the World Facebook group. If you want to supercharge your wisdom and start learning that right order to break out of that wrong contradictory thinking, that sophist kind of thinking, the wisdom quiz is to supercharge that. If you have a favorite philosopher, we can start also sublating them and putting them in the synchronicity document of philosophies. We're going to be doing this with technologies as real activism to put philosophy back in its rightful place, to have sort of a say in how to use these technologies like CRISPR. Your supercharged interpersonal dialectics has this kind of map on how not to be a sophist and how to recognize when somebody is, so we can get sort of beyond this feeling of abstract philosophy that nobody wants to engage with it, you know. We're going to find out where exactly the sublations need to happen by doing this universal survey. We're going to sort of make it into a spectator sport, kind of fun, where the whole goal is sublation, not to just destroy your opponent, but to actually reach the ideal harmony. And that's where people are going to cheer. We're going to build a new ideal state, not a new ideal order, a new ideal world spirit. We're going to do that through the universal form of reason, which we just saw turn itself into its own object as the ontological proof in the coherence of God in the supersensuous realm. If you're an atheist, we're just saying the science of science. And then we're going to go into the religious world, and we're going to not perform colonialism and a new form of imperialism. We know that the truth is immanent in all these other modes. They're just limited in some way. And when we grasp that limit, we're going to bring the logic out from within their culture. No domination, no appropriation. We're doing this authentically to sublate and get to the truth, whether it's the Christian Bible, the Quran, Buddhism, Vedas, anything. We're going to go and learn and be humble and figure out what the truth is to fulfill these foundations, not negate them. And the last thing is we're going to show this publicly around the world and demonstrate it through a new media, where it's basically the new media for genuine philosophy. So tomorrow, yes, we're going to try and do this more practically, and we're going to show how when we really grasp this kind of proof, this way of super coherence and correspondence, we're doing a supercharged form of modern science, which can win the not just the Nobel Peace Prize, but can win all 5 Nobel Prizes if we do it in its truly living form, which means we will have to do this in a secular way as well. So we'll get into that tomorrow, and then hopefully our atheistic world spirits will get inspired, and they will become these agents of the new genuine philosophical change that we all want to be. So thank you. Please join me for the discussions, and if not, keep sublating and stay free.